Good morning, everyone. All right, let's start with the session. All right, so far, majorly what we have seen is what is a batch class? What is the purpose of writing a batch class? If we are writing a batch class, what is the structure of that? How many different methods are there to make a class as a batch class? Which interface do we require to implement? What is the possible access specifiers of a batch class, public and global? How many number of the times you can call start method, execute method, and finish method? What is majorly a difference between database.query or database.getQuery locator if you are executing a dynamic query? What is the purpose of writing start method, execute method, and finish method? Then we also, during the program, we also have seen what does it means by explicit typecasting and generic programming. We also have seen what is the purpose of SObject. Then we also have seen how to form the batches, how to divide the records into the batches. What is the default batch size? 200. What is the range of batch? It's from 1 to 2000. How to call, how to invoke a batch program. The batch programs, whenever we wanted to execute, how we can execute them using database.execute batch method. And because whenever the batch is executed, it is always executed out of the organization, the scope of out of the organization. And so the governor limits related to batch is not applied. Even the log file is not created for that. So if a batch is executed, how we can track the results programmatically or onto the user interface. So I told you that yesterday itself, we have discussed that. There can be 2 or 3 ways to see that. If you are performing any DML operations like update, delete, insert, then you can go to that particular object. If you have the access to that object, you can go with the object on the user interface part and like, for example, here, and you can see whether the record is being inserted, updated, deleted, or undeleted. That could be the first way. The second way could be like you can go to the setup menu once again in user interface, go to monitor, go to job. And there is one tab, there is one link called Apex job. When you make a click onto that, you can see the status of the job, the batch job which is being run. So this was about user interface. What about programming? From the programming, if I wanted to track this, how we can track? So we have learned that there is one object, one standard object called as async apex job. There's one standard object called async apex job. So from that object itself, we can track that object itself. From that object itself, we can track the result of a batch program. So these were all of the things what we have learned so far. Now let me conclude this discussion of batch programming, and we shall start the new concepts of async like flex queues, future methods, queuable interfaces, and schedulable programming. These all are still outstanding and upcoming topics. But there's one more thing which I need to tell you about a batch program. What does it mean by the stateful interfaces? All right. Let me try to explain you this with one of the diagram I have. Yes, stateful interfaces. Now see. Let's try to understand one of the scenario where we could discuss this, because see, it's really difficult to implement. I cannot show you, cannot create a program to reflect the changes for this. So this is ultimately is going to be a theoretical topic. You have to understand this right now. But yes, we can definitely include this in the program. I'm going to show you the same as well. But first of all, let's understand. See, let's consider you're fetching the data You're fetching the data from the account object. That means in your batch program, I would go to my batch program. Let me go to the developer console. Let me try to open that class which we have created. So it was something in hiring manager batch, I guess. It's hiring manager update batch. So this is a batch class what we have created. Now see, let's consider for now that this query which I have written inside the start method, because we always write down the query inside the start method itself. In the start method, the purpose we already have discussed. I'm not going to revise the same thing again and again. All right. So the query part, the SQL query, the dynamic SQL query, which we write down and which we execute using database.getQueryLocator, it's always done inside the start method. That is what is the role of start method, right? That is what is the role of start method. So start method typically is used to execute the query, get the data, form the batches, and finally then with the help of database.queryLocator, transfer that batches one by one to the execute method. That's why in the execute method, the second parameter we always define as a list collection to catch those records, nothing else. Anyways, so let's consider for now, for instance, consider that this batch class which I have written is on account. And so we are getting the data from the account object. All right. Just for an instance, just for an example. Now let's consider that account is having 24 records, all 24 records. Now I am wanted to write down a batch class so that, see, there's a field called annual revenue. We all know this. If I would take you to the account object, inside an account, there is a field called as annual revenue. You see, isn't it? It is over there. Let me, all accounts. So here you can see that, right? Here you can see annual revenue. Or let me try to fire a query. Select from account. Take few fields like ID, comma, name, comma, annual revenue, from the account where annual revenue value is not equals to null. It's not equals to null. So let me get all those records. So there are these 16 records where you can see the value of annual revenue is not null. All right. Let's consider these are 16 million records. For instance, consider these are 16 million records. These are 16 million records. Now I wanted to create a program that let's consider I have a field called total annual revenue. All right. I have a field called total annual revenue like this. I have a field called total annual revenue. For instance, let's assume that we have a field that called total annual revenue. Inside in the account object, we have a field called total revenue. I wanted to build up a program in a way like, it would going to add all of the annual revenue records. Like if I have this, at the end of this, I wanted to add all these annual revenue records, and let's assume that comes out to be let's say 500 million, 500 million it comes out to be. And this value I wanted to store inside a field called total revenue. There's a field inside account object called total revenue. This is an assumption, of course, it's an assumption. And what I wanted to do, I wanted to take the individual annual revenue records, annual revenue value from each record. And then I wanted to perform the addition of all those annual revenue records over here. And then at the end of this, I wanted to return the total sum of annual revenue, and that should be stored inside a field called total annual revenue, something like that. This is my program. Now we consider that we have more than 10 million records over here. For an instance, for example, let's consider that we have more than 10 million records over here. Just a moment. Yeah. So how to perform that? Obviously, I told you one thing. See, we need to access a bulk amount of record. First thing, if this problem has been given to you, if this requirement has been given to you, how would you start thinking in a lexical way so that you could solve the problem? So that I'm going to, tell you. So I would first of all would see the problem like, oh, what I wanted to perform. What I wanted to perform. I wanted to perform the addition of the all annual revenues, individual annual revenue records. I wanted to add them. And how much data we are expecting. We are expecting data in millions. So if I'm using this, if I would be creating this on sandbox, let's consider inside in my sandbox, there are only 16 records. But you tell me one thing. What do you assume when this program, which I am trying to build, when I'm going to, when I'm going to deploy this to a final prod environment, production environment, do it's supposed to handle a small amount of data like this? Or it is expected to handle a bulk amount of record, could be in the billions as well, could be in the millions as well. Yes, of course. So considering that possibility in mind, you always have to think beyond what you see. You know, you always have to think beyond what you see. Because in the sandbox, you see a very limited set of data in sandbox, very small amount of data. But that is not going to be the real case when you would deploy this to the production environment. So this is very important. This is very important to perform those predictions, even though when you are developing this onto the sandbox, your imagination should go beyond your existing environment. This is very important, right? Trainings usually does not cover that. I always try to make you understand that the things what I'm saying to you is beyond the trainings, the scope of the training. These are something which I'm always try to convince you from my past experiences, from the things which I have learned in this journey and which I'm learning. I'm still a learner. So whatever I used to learn, I always used to share that. And this is the reason. See, I don't think in this program I probably is going to perform any DML operation, I guess. If we have that field created inside the account object, I could update that. Yeah, that could be a DML operation. Otherwise, in this program, I would be going to create a variable wherein I would be going to transfer the value of total revenue. So I don't think in this program, I'm not going to perform any DML operation. Still, we would construct a batch program. Because see, I have told you you have to keep two things in your mind. Whenever you are taking this decision to create a batch program, you have to have these two requirements in your mind. Either you are performing an operation on bulk amount of records, or second, you are performing a DML operations, again on the bulk amount. So I guess for this program, I'm not going to perform any DML operation still, because I wanted to perform the addition of all of the annual revenue records, all of the annual revenues inside in every record. And records could be in billion, records could be in million, or beyond that. I would have to construct a batch program. This is very important to understand, guys. This is very important to understand. Why should I go with the batch program for this? All right. So what I wanted to do, I wanted to perform the addition of all annual revenue records. And at the end of the program, I'll have to submit that this is the total annual revenue out of every single record of the account manager. And particularly in my query, I have skipped those annual revenue where the value was null, because if it is null, obviously we don't have to take into that consideration. Why should I take it? Why should I count them? The accountability of those records are not. Why? Because the value of annual revenue is null. If it is null, it's going to count it for 0. Why should I include them in the query? See, we also have learned the SQL best practices, the best practices of writing the queries, right? Everywhere, I always have tried to given you those, right? The best practices. I guess that is there inside the query as well. If I would go with SQL, I would go with SQL. I'm going to probably find it out in all. right? Let me take you to the 95. Oh, that was way back. So way back. Let's directly branch to that topic. That's ORM list collection. Maybe, yeah, this is the topic, but I'm not sure where I have written this. The best practices of writing an SQL query. Static. Yeah, see over here it has been written. There are only few of the best practices. The first, you should not include any SQL query within the loop. Within the loop, whether it's a dynamic or whether it's an static, should not include them within the loop. Why? Because there is a possibility to hit the governor limit. We can only use 100. We can only have 100 SQL queries. And if your loop would iterate more than 100 times, you're obviously going to get an error system dot limit exception. Too many DMLs, too many SQL queries. 101, 101, 101. So that's why, we never include SQL query within the loop. We always keep it outside the loop. Whatever loop, or loop, while loop, do while loop. And second, don't fetch unnecessary informations. See, I could skip this part. I could skip this part and I can fire a query. I'm going to get 139 results. You tell me one thing, do we are really interested to see those accounts record where the value of annual revenue is null? Are they going to serve any purpose? Are these kinds of record where the value of annual revenue is null? Are they going to serve any purpose in this use case? Obviously not. Here we are interested only on those accounts records which have the value of annual revenue. And so that is the reason, that is the reason I have optimized the query. Now, getting 139 records and getting 16 records, obviously the overhead, the kind of overhead is reduced over here. So always try to optimize your query as specifically as possible. Try just to write down that, ask the query, always try to ask the query to get only those records in which you are interested and not in everything. Not in everything. All right. So that is one of another way. All right. So we are trying to construct a program wherein we wanted to perform the addition of all annual revenue records. And let's say we have a field we wanted to, at the end of the program, we would probably going to store this total annual revenue inside a field. Let's assume that. Now, because we are expecting this program to manipulate, we are expecting this program to process millions of the record. So this is the reason why I have decided to construct a batch program for this requirement. All right. Now let me go back. Let me take you back to this diagram and let's try to understand few of the things. Now let's consider that you have created a batch size of, with this small example. The mathematics would become with the less figures, and ज़्यादा बड़ा figure लूंगा तो it becomes a little more maths. So let's consider there are only 24 records. Just for an instance, for example, let's consider there are, only 24 records, and you have selected the batch size as 4. So it would be like 24 divided by 4. 6 4s are 24. Finally, there would be like 6 records per batch. All right, there are 24 records. As the batch size you selected is 4. That means 4 records per batch. So 24 divided by 4 would give you 6. So there are going to be 6 records. There are going to be 6 records per batch. So let's consider this is batch B1. When B1 is executed, we have built up a logic in a way like it would perform the addition of all annual revenue records. And that comes out to be like 35. All right, that comes out to be 35, 100,000 million, whatever. And then the batch 2 would be executed. Batch 2 would be executed and it comes out to be with 75. And then batch 3 and batch 4, and this is that figure, this is that just a tentative figure, just an example. This all is coming up like this. Now what we want, at the end of this program, we wanted to perform the addition of all this, and let's consider that comes out to be just an example, maybe 135. That comes out to be 135. Simple, just an example. So this is what should be the outcome and output of the final batch. After the final batch, let's say batch B6 would be executed. After that, everything have been executed. We wanted the output should be like this. So ideally, what should happen? So And the output of the outcome of, let's say we have a variable called total annual revenue record, TAR, equals to 35. So after the first batch execution has been completed, this variable total annual revenue record TAR have 35. And when the batch B2 would execute it, it should be like, it should be like the old value of TAR. TAR should equals to TAR plus, TAR plus 75. And the previous value of TAR plus 75. So the new value should go to TR once again. Then in every case, this should be like this only. The new value of TAR should be the old value of TAR, total annual revenue, plus the recent one, the recent addition is 24. It should grow like this. Now I'll tell you what is going to be happen. First, the TAR should have 35. The value of becomes 35. All right. In the second case, even though when you have written a formula that TAR should equals to the previous value of TAR plus the new value. What is the new value? New value 75. And you are expecting 35 plus 75, 110. But it would be not. When this second batch would going to be executed, when it comes to the second batch, first time was TAR equals to 35. The second time we have written a formula like the old value of TAR plus the new value. And so what we are expecting 35 plus 75, that gives you 110. But I'll tell you what is the result. Result would be 75 only. Why 75? Because when the new batch would execute it, this value becomes 0. 0 plus 75. And so the value is 70. This happens every time. Like for the next batch, like what you are expecting 110. What you are expecting 110 is the previous value plus 24. So you should get 134. But you are not going to get this value becomes 0. 0 plus 24, you are going to get only 24. So ideally what happens is like, now listen this carefully. Listen this very carefully. Whenever a batch is executed, whenever one batch is executed, and runtime engine starts the processing of another batch, runtime engine, Apex runtime engine, compiler, it would start execution of the previous the next batch, the execute method, rather. The execute method, when it starts the execution of another batch, everything from the previous batch is being erased. Everything. Every batch always starts with a fresh governor limit. The governor limit and everything, the variables, the collections, the memories, everything is cleared. All of them would contain null. So if you have defined a variable, for example, TAR, where you have stored the value of, you collected the sum of all annual revenue records, and you were expecting that this value should get transferred to the next batch. In a default case, this is not going to be happen. So as soon as this batch would come into processing, immediately the TAR becomes null. TAR becomes 0. After that, when this batch would start, again that variable becomes 0. So all of those variables, all of those collections, whatever you have defined in the program, whenever the batch, from the execution goes from one batch to another batch, whenever a new batch is being started, is being processed, everything is being reset, even including the governor limits as well, right? Including the governor limits as well. So this is the reason we are not going to get the result of. We are not going to get this result as expected. The value of the sum of the annual revenue is not going to transfer from one batch to another batch. If you have written this logic like we did it in the past. So whenever we wanted to implement this transfer from one batch to another batch, whenever we want that inside in my program, or let me construct a program first of all, I'll talk later on to this. Let me first of all construct a program for this. 1 second. Yes. All right. So, let me try to create a program first of all. I would be creating one new batch class for this. So I'm writing a new Apex class, and let me give the name as calculate total annual revenue batch. So I would be creating one batch program, one another batch program for this, right? So the scope, I can keep it public as well, no problem. Public and global is allowed. And to make this class as a batch class, see, even though if I would save it right now, it's not going to give me any error at this moment, right? Why? Because this is perfect. This is according to the syntax of defining a normal class, this syntax is absolutely right. So there would be obviously no syntactical error into this. But as soon as I ask for implements, as soon as I would ask for implements, database dot batchable along with a parameter as SO object. And when I try to save it now, it would going to give me the error. It would going to give me the error. What is going to be that error? What is going to be that error? It is expecting all three methods: start, execute, finish. Right? So it is expecting all three methods. Every batch program must have all these three methods, right? You cannot skip even a single of them. All right. So let me try to define in a way how we have learned this. So there must be a start method. There must be a start method and an execute method, as well as finish method, right? There must be a start, execute, and finish. Let's talk about the return type as well, right? So yeah, first of all, their scope. So I can define the scope as global and public in both. Global. Your execute method should also be defined as global, and your finish method, global. Now let's talk about their return type. So the execute method and finish method, both of them have return type as void, whereas the start method have database dot query locator. Database dot query locator. So database dot query locator is the return type of your start method. Now let's talk about their parameters. So there is one context which used to have which is used to form that communication between all three of them, and that context is database dot batchable context. P context. I can just copy this. I can just copy and paste it everywhere. Inside in the execute method, inside in the finish method. The execute method, although we're going to have one more parameter, I would define this as list of S object record to process. You can give any name. Let's try to give it generic, nothing else. Now, this is what is called as to be the structure of a batch class, right? And if they would ask you this in the interview, you'll have to write down the same thing. So I would be first of all creating that logic. I would first of all would create that logic by which we can perform the addition of annual revenues of all accounts. All right. So let me define a variable inside in the start method. So I would be defining a variable. The variable should also have the access specifier. I'm keeping it global in every case. Global decimal, let's say total annual revenue. Total annual revenue. And I'm defining for now, I'm defining this with 0.0. 0.0. That means 0 and simple. All right. I would be creating a query. I would be creating. No, I shouldn't define this inside the start method. Yes, sorry, methods. Execute method may be used on. So if I would define this inside the start method, तो उसका scope यहीं तक bounded हो जाएगा. Let's do one thing. इसको मैं यहाँ पे define करता हूँ. ठीक है. I would be defining this. This is something called as global scope. When you define something within the class level, that method, that variable or that collection becomes what? It becomes global. उसको बोलते हैं उसका scope global कहलाता है. because you can now access this variable within the scope of class itself. Yeah, सब जगह आप use कर सकते हैं. If I would be defining this inside in over here, then I can use this inside the start method. लेकिन execute method में भी मुझे काम है. So that is the reason I have defined this as a global variable. And now. So let me first of all write down the query string, let's say accounts query equals to, right? So I would be writing that query. I already have created it. Let me just copy and paste it. So I wanted to get the names, ID preferably, and annual revenue of account, but I am not fetching everything. I am optimizing my query so that it should return me only those accounts record where the value of annual revenue specifically is not. I'm more interested into that. All right. And then let me execute this, because just writing the query does not mean it is going to be executed. This is a dynamic query. The major differences between static and dynamic is static queries, they are automatically executed whenever the method is invoked. If the static query is written inside a method like start, and when the start method would come into the invocation, whenever this method is going to be executed, if this was a static query, we cannot write over here, because a static query can only return you 50,000 records, whereas we are going to execute this with database.getQueryLocator, and it's going to return 5 billion. Anyways, static queries are executed automatically. Dynamic queries requires particularly an additional method for that. In a normal case, it is database.query, but here inside in the bash program, it would be database.getQueryLocator. Database.getQueryLocator. I would be using this flavor of that, where I just require to mention the name of query. Database.getQueryLocator. All right. And my query is present inside in this variable, so I would be writing this, and the same I'm going to return. That means I would be returning this to database.queryLocator. QueryLocator would perform the batch sizing and everything, and one by one, it is going to transfer the batches to your execute method. Let me try to see what is the error is coming up. Execute. Spelling as object. Yes, the spelling was wrong. That's why. Because after writing this, we are not expecting any error. So that is the reason I was trying to see what it is coming. So spelling of S object was wrong. Yeah. All right. So now this query is going to return only those accounts where the value of annual revenue is null. By the way, these are those records. And I mean, they have been written. They have been, one by one, the batches, they have been written into record to process. So when I go to the execute method, my first responsibility is to check for null pointer exception. And the first responsibility is to check for null pointer exception. So what we are going to see, that this record to process is not null, So obviously, very obviously, I would be checking for like if not of record to process, because that is a collection, I'll have to use a method called as is empty. So if it is not empty, it have records, it have the batches, then we would design the further logic. So I would be iterating them. I would be first of all iterating every single record from record to process. Presently, their data type is S object, which I would be going to typecast later on. I would be collecting this every record inside a local variable called obj, and then in the first step, although I would going to perform the typecasting. So presently the records are present inside obj, right? I wanted to convert them into what? Account. Because every record was account record, but in the generic programming, I have collected them inside a list of S object. Yesterday, we have discussed this everything, right? So I'm just explaining the detailed the description of that. And I consider that yesterday it was in that session, I have explained you everything in detail. This equals to, now because there's only one record every time, I would be collecting this inside a variable of account ACC equals to this, right? So that is what I'm going to do. Yeah. Now, the typecasting has been performed. That means you have every record inside the variable called ACC. ACC, right? So I now do one thing, that total annual revenue. This variable where the initial value is 0, I would be writing like total annual revenue. Record equals to no, plus equals to, because that's a dynamic assignment. Plus equals to, and I wanted to increment this every time. So it would be like ACC dot annual revenue. Now, what is going to be happen? See how this loop is going to go. Let's consider there are, there are 16 or 15 whatever record. The first record जो यहाँ से select हो गया, let's consider this is Merck Incorporation having all this annual revenue. तो पहला record जो आया वो ये था. So total annual revenue plus equals to, plus को side में रखो, equals to रखो, equals to ACC dot this. तो total annual revenue की value जो है becomes this one. फिर सेकेंड रिकॉर्ड जब आता है तो सुरेश कुमार शर्मा हैविंग द एनुअल रेवेन्यू 890,765. तो नाउ प्लस इक्वल्स टू मतलब क्या होता है, फर्स्ट इंक्रीमेंट दिस एंड देन इंक्रीमेंट एंड असाइनमेंट बोलते हैं उसको. सो दैट एनुअल रेवेन्यू बिकम्स लाइक एसीसी, जो पहला वैल्यू है, ठीक है, दिस वैल्यू इज गोइंग टू बी इंक्रीमेंटेड बाय, मतलब प्रीवियस वैल्यू क्या है ये, दैट्स वैल्यू इज गोइंग टू बी इंक्रीमेंटेड यानी किसके साथ, प्लस दिस सेकंड वैल्यू ऑफ एनुअल रेवेन्यू. उसके बाद जो वट एवर द न्यू वैल्यू इज गोइंग टू बी असाइन इनटू दिस. सो इस तरह से बैच B1 में जैसे कंसीडर कि मैंने 4 रिकॉर्ड दे रखे, तो 1 2 3 एंड 4, ठीक है, अप टू ओवर हियर, मतलब अगर बैच साइज में 4 देता हूँ तो ये पहले 4 रिकॉर्ड्स का एनुअल रेवेन्यू जो भी बनता है, दैट इज बीइंग कलेक्टेड, that is being not collected, that is being added, and it is stored, it is stored inside this variable total annual. ये हो गया बैच B1 का एग्जीक्यूशन, ये हो गया बैच B1 का. देन कम्स बैच B2. लेकिन अब जब बैच B2 आएगा, वी वर एक्सपेक्टिंग कि टोटल एनुअल रेवेन्यू वुड कंटेन द प्रीवियस वैल्यू. हम क्या अज्यूम कर रहे हैं कि टोटल एनुअल रेवेन्यू में ये चारों का जो एडिशन हुआ है, ये 4 रिकॉर्ड्स का जो एडिशन हुआ है, उसका जो भी सम आया, दैट इज देयर इनसाइड टोटल एनुअल रेवेन्यू. और फिर जब बैच B2 एग्जिस्टेंस में आई तो फिर उसने स्टार्ट करा कि भाई TAR प्लस ये वाला वैल्यू, फिर उसका सम ऐसा. तो व्हाट वी वर एक्सपेक्टिंग कि भैया TAR जो है, मतलब इन द फर्स्ट केस इट वुड कंटेन द एडिशन ऑफ दिस, ये वाला वैल्यू जो है, दिस वैल्यू इज प्रेजेंट, दिस वैल्यू इज देयर इनसाइड योर वेरिएबल TAR. So when the next batch would come into existence and it would process these 4 records, so what we are expecting कि previous value जो थी, that plus ये वाला value, फिर ये ऐसे चलेगा. But ideally this is not going to be happen. As soon as the batch B1 का process complete होता है and it would start executing B2. जैसे for an example, let's consider कि TR का value जो आया था, that comes out to be 50 million, ऐसा assume करो. And what we are expecting है 50 million plus ये होना चाहिए 10,000, 60 million नहीं होता. As soon as batch B2 comes into existence, comes into processing, TR becomes 0. So 0 plus whatever is the fresh 10,000, 1 lakh, 10 lakh, whatever that figure is. So this previous value of variable becomes 0, and this is what is the default processing of a batch program. So ये हो गया. अभी finish method में कुछ नहीं लिख रहा हूँ. So whatever the variable that you have defined, whatever the collection that you have defined, all of them is reset to 0. Whenever the control moves from one batch to another batch. Whenever the runtime engine, when the compiler process one batch to another batch, everything is reset, even the governor limits also. But we don't want this to be get happen. I cannot show you the result. I cannot show you the result in this case. You have to merely assume this, because this is going to be executed, this is going to be executed beyond the scope of batch class. I cannot show you the result of this, but we can understand with the program itself, we can understand. अभी तक हमने इतना लॉजिक तो डेवलप कर चुका कि just by looking into the program, we can assume what is going to be happen in the backend when this is going to be executed. All right. So how would you process this? How would you transfer the result of one batch class to another batch class, not class. How would you transfer the result of execution of one batch to another batch? Batch B1 was executed और B1 execute होने के बाद total annual revenue की value 50,000 हो गई थी, assume करो. फिर batch B2 जब आता है 50, ये total annual revenue is again reset to zero, reset back to the zero आ गया, because B1 से जब B2 में गया तो सारी गवर्नर लिमिट, सारे वेरिएबल, सारे कलेक्शन रीसेट हो चुके हैं. तो B2 जब स्टार्ट हुआ टोटल एनुअल रेवेन्यू फिर से जीरो हो गया. फिर B2 में जो कुछ भी कैलकुलेट किया उसने, लेट्स कंसीडर B2 में 30,000 आया, B2 से B3 में गया तो फिर से इसकी वैल्यू जीरो हो गई, राइट, इसकी वैल्यू जीरो हो गई. सो हाउ शुड वी कैरी फॉरवर्ड द रिजल्ट्स, द वैल्यूज ऑफ द वेरिएबल्स, the values of the collection from one batch to another batch? This is the last outstanding question in the batch class. So for this, whenever this is your use case wherein you wanted to transfer the outcome, of one batch to another. I guess we can, no, we cannot do that. Yes. So whenever you wanted to transfer the outcome of one batch to another batch, whenever you wanted to transfer the values of variables or the values of any collection if you have from one batch to another batch, then we would ask for one more interface. Like we already have one interface, database.batchable. We would ask for one more interface. So I'll put up a comma over here. And then I would ask for database.stateful. Database.stateful interface. Full की spelling FUL होती है, I guess. I don't know. अगर error होगा तो error आ जाएगा. So this is the another interface, database.stateful. So somebody, sometimes they would ask you directly what is a stateful interface, or they would ask you, they will try to twist the program. So if I wanted to transfer the outcome of one batch to another batch, if there are, few of the variables which I have defined, which are having certain values, and I wanted to transfer that value from one batch to another batch execution, how can you do that? So you have to add one more decorator. You have to add one more interface called database.stateful. You have to add one more interface called database.stateful. So now, now when you execute this program, I can execute no problem. It's not going to create any impression throughout because we are not performing any DML operations. Although, let me even the chalo मैं इसको execute करके दिखा देता हूँ तुमको. So in the first step, whenever we execute, how to execute we know. Let's discuss उसका revision भी हो जाता है. The first step, you have to create the object of a batch class. So I would be creating like C object equals to new this class, and now execute this with database dot execute batch, and I'm going to give the size as 4 over here. 4 is my size, and object name is C object. And let's try to execute this. So even though if we have executed that, even though if we are not going to get anything over here. Log में हमें कुछ नहीं मिलने वाला. ठीक है, लॉग में हमें कुछ नहीं मिलने वाला है ना, कोई डीएमएल ऑपरेशन नहीं है, इसलिए ऑब्जेक्ट लेवल पे भी कुछ नहीं मिलेगा. यस, बट ऑफ कोर्स वी कैन सी इट फ्रॉम हियर. एसिंक अपेक्स जॉब पे क्वेरी फायर करके आप ले सकते हो, मतलब यू कैन फायर अ क्वेरी ऑन एसिंक अपेक्स, वहां से आपको इसकी डिटेल मिल सकती है. ठीक है, यहाँ पर देख लो. और या फिर यू कैन गो टू जॉब्स and you can go to apex job. There also you can see batch is completed, right? The batch is completed. Batch total batch the 4. Why? Because 4 because we have I guess there were only 16 records. Yeah, so 4 divided by 4 is 16. Number of them process is 4. Number of failures is 0. Nothing has been failed. All right, the name of batch was this, or ye tha uska ID. So basically I cannot show you the output over here. More important, whether output was not important. The more important thing was to understand how we can transfer the records inside records go wrong. The values inside a variable or the values inside the collection from one batch execution to another batch execution. So for that, you have to again attach one more interface called database.stateful. So this is what is the purpose of stateful interfaces. The stateful interfaces would help you out to carry forward the execution result of one batch to another batch. So if you have defined a variable or maybe a collection where you are collecting the outcome, where you are collecting certain values of execution of a batch, and you wanted this value should be get transferred, this variable value, this collection value should get transferred from one batch to another batch, then you would have to ask for database.stateful interface. Otherwise, in a normal class, always whenever the one batch is shifted from one batch to another, the execution is shifted from one batch to another batch, everything is reset. The variables you have defined, the collections you have defined, and all of the governance. So that's why we should attach database.stateful interface. So that was one another thing over here. That's all. That's all. So in the next program, I'm going to start with another concept called, I guess, flex queues. Let me see to this. Yeah. So by the next class, I would be going to start. This is just a theoretical concept, but yet important concept, flex queues. Any questions so far? Oh, let me give you this command. You can now unmute yourself. Yes. Any questions? Any questions? Yes. Anybody have any questions in mind? Please go ahead and ask. Yeah. Nothing to discuss. All right. Then. Thank you so much for joining.